Hello! If you're new to my channel, my name is Annabelle, and in this video I'm going to be redrawing a scene from one of my favorite Studio Ghibli movies, The Secret World of Arrietty. Redrawing artwork from professional animation is always a great way to learn, so I thought we could go through the process together. The software I'll be using is Pro Procreate on the iPad Pro because that's what I always use, and I'm also going to be using Procreate default brushes because there are plenty of great options to choose from. So this is the scene that I have decided to draw. I was initially torn between this scene and another scene where Arrietty ties her hair back with a crocodile clip, but I ended up going for this one because of its greenery and the color palette. Although it seems like quite a simple composition at first glance, what I like about this one the most is that you really get a sense of scale. Compared to her surroundings, she really looks like a tiny character. So here is the rough sketch that I've made of this scene. I stylized it in my own way, especially with Arrietty's hairstyle and a slightly more exaggerated facial expression, turning the corners of her mouth downward and leaving a little bit of space between her iris and her eyelashes is what gives her this surprised or concerned expression. I divided the sketch into 3 sections to keep things simple. First you have the background leaves, then you have Arrietty and her leaf in the middle ground, and then the raindrops in the foreground. I'm going to start with the line art for Arrietty first, so I'm going to toggle off the other sketch layers and work on things one step at a time. I begin by lowering the sketch's opacity and selecting the peppermint brush. This is the brush that I'm going to use for all of the line art. As always, I start by drawing the eyes and work my way outwards from there. Wherever there is a close-up of a character, the eyes are almost always going to be the main focal point of the piece, so I prefer to make sure I get the details right there first. I like to use long, deliberate strokes with my pen so that the lines stay clean, but since the peppermint brush is slightly transparent, I sometimes go over some spots again, particularly where 2 lines overlap. For example, where the ear and the jaw connect. Adding a bit of variety to the line thickness can make line art appear less two-dimensional and give the impression that the shapes have some volume and form. When I draw her hair, I separate it into big sections, beginning with the hair that frames her face. Instead of trying to sketch each individual hair strand, I want to keep the overall shape of the hair relatively simple, with the outer silhouette taking center stage. I'm attempting to find a balance between my typical method of drawing hair and how it's frequently depicted in the Studio Ghibli style. Then I'll focus more on her figure and clothing, paying great attention to the original shapes in the reference image. I've touched on this a little bit in my previous videos, but I particularly appreciate Studio Ghibli's use of rounded edges and blob shapes in their character and clothing designs. I find it to be extremely pleasing to the eye. I'm now going to begin working on the plant that she's holding up like an umbrella, which is my favorite aspect of the entire image, I think. In this movie, I love how enormous everything feels when you see it from Arrietty's perspective. In my opinion, the art team did an incredible job of making an everyday environment, such as a garden or a house, feel like an entirely different world that is both epic and also full of challenges. It's very impressive. And to finish all the line art, I'm just going to add in the outer edges of the wall. It's another simple shape that doesn't require too much thought right now because the texture that I'm going to add later will make all the difference. And here is the completed line art. This is the only line art that I'm going to include in the piece because I'm going to try to recreate the background without line art, just like the reference image. Now I'm ready to start adding all the flat colors. I begin by making the background sketch visible and bring up the color palette thumbnail that I've created in advance to help with the color selection. I have stylized these colors a little by shifting the hue of the greens more towards the blue side of the spectrum and increasing the overall brightness and saturation to make the colors stand out a little bit more. This time I'm going to select and use the Studio Pen brush, and as before I'm going to start with Arrietty first. I add all of the flat colors below the line art layer and I use it kind of like a standard coloring book, concentrating first on the larger shapes such as her skin, hair and clothing. I also paint the plant and the wall in flat colors too. The Studio Pen brush is lacking in texture, which isn't the best, but I will add more texture later on during the drawing process. For the shapes that aren't entirely enclosed by line art, such as the eyes and the lips, I select the ink bleed brush because I like the texture. The lips in the original image don't have any color, but I like to add a little bit of color to mine. Now that the foreground and the middle ground flat colors have been completed, it's time to start working on the background flat colors. And I must admit, this is going to be out of my comfort zone. As I mentioned before, I'll be drawing these shapes without line art, using my rough sketch as a guide and constantly scanning the reference image to identify where each individual leaf shape should be positioned. Thankfully, the majority of the time, they are quite simple shapes, primarily grass blades and rounded leaves that are repeated in different orientations. Oh, and I'm also using the same ink bleed brush that I selected previously for this. To make things easier, I begin by drawing the leaves that are closest to the character first and work my way backwards from there. To give the impression of depth and variety, I'm not only using different shades, but also different hues of green. For instance, some leaves will have a more blue undertone, while others will have a more yellow undertone. This really adds to the appearance of a natural and authentic garden scene. To prevent this task from becoming too overwhelming, I try to simplify the shapes as much as I possibly can and keep things on different layers, as I'll be going back to add some more color variations later on. When you're trying to create a background with a lot of greenery, it can be pretty intimidating, but taking each leaf one step at a time is really beneficial. I was quite surprised by how quickly building up these simple shapes in different colors and forms can really create the illusion of a lot going on. But once I finally nailed down all the major leaf shapes, I added dark brown color to the background to represent the dirt. And with that, the flat colors for the leaves are complete. And this is what the piece looks like so far. There's still quite a lot of work to be done, clearly, but it's looking a lot closer to the original already. Now let's move on to the rendering process, where we'll add all the textures, shadows, and highlights that will really make this piece pop. First, I'm going to select the Bonobo chalk brush and use this to add some light blush to her cheeks and forehead. The texture this brush produces is just a chef's kiss. It is my all-time favorite Procreate brush, for sure. Now I'm reselecting the ink bleed brush and creating a new multiply layer to start adding some shadows to Arrietty. I always refer back to the original work of art and follow the contours of the shadows that they have so nicely created for us already. On her skin, I can see that the light source is most likely coming from the right-hand side, and there is a very distinct shadow cast from the leaf that she is holding above her head. This is one of the main things I love about redrawing from existing artworks, because you can observe how they did the lighting situation and learn from it yourself. I try to keep the form of the shadows quite simple because that is the Studio Ghibli way, but I do also want to add my own interesting effect. So I set the shadow layer to alpha lock, and to simulate a little bit of subsurface scattering on the skin, I like to add some warmth to the edges of the shadows using a warmer hue and a large soft airbrush. Although it is extremely subtle, I believe this small detail in the shadow always elevates an illustration. I think it looks super cool. Then, using the original artwork as a reference again, I begin to create the shadows for the hair. Almost all of the hair on her left-hand side is in the shade formed by the leaf that she's holding, with the exception of a few hair strands that just barely catch some sunlight. For the same reason, the left part of her clothing is also in the shadow. Now I'm going to go back to that leaf up above. I start by adding in some brown details that I forgot to include in the flat coloring process, but then I use a new multiply layer to start adding the shadows. When looking at the original artwork, the shapes are once again quite easy to replicate. It appears a little unimpressive at the moment because the leaf has more highlights than it does shadows overall, but we'll begin adding highlights to these two sections that we've completed right now. I begin with Arrietty, adding some subtle highlights to her hair on an overlay layer. I mostly place them on the right-hand side where the light source is coming from. Then, using a Bonobo chalk eraser, I smooth off the edges and add some texture to the highlights to make them a little less harsh. I also add some highlights to the edges of her clothes and face to finish up, and now all the rendering for Arrietty is complete. Time to transition back to the leaf now. This is my favorite part of the entire process, since I find Studio Ghibli's usage of these blobby rounded shapes to be so fun and aesthetically pleasing. And to achieve the best likeness, I adhere to the reference photo as closely as I can. And the finished leaf looks a little something like this. Now I want to finish up the wall. The textures are the reason why I've left this all the way up until now. I want to work on rendering the entire thing at once because it's not as easy to split it up into simply shadows and highlights. So I start by choosing the gouache brush. The wall has, as far as I can tell, 3 distinct tones: green on the right, dark gray in the middle, and pastel blue on the top left. So I use the gouache brush to add in these gradients. Next, I select the wild light brush and begin to add some darker splotches to the lower third of the wall. Following the reference image, I keep building up the layers of green, blue, and black to create this really rough texture on the walls. Even though a stone wall is usually supposed to be a grey colour, the presence of rain will really affect the colours in this scene. You'll get a little bit of a blue hue coming from the water itself, and also some green coloured reflections from the surroundings will also be present on the wet surface. I've accepted that it's probably not going to be a perfect replica compared to what you see in the reference image, especially because it is so textured and abstract, but it's good enough. Now it's time to add some more colour variation to the plants in the background. I'm going to use the gouache brush again for any gradients and the ink bleed brush for any lines. As a way to give the leaves a little bit more visual appeal, I'm using the reference image to incorporate various color streaks throughout the leaves. The background will be slightly out of focus, so this doesn't need to be absolutely flawless. Most of the time, I only add one different color variation to each leaf, whether it be by adding a little extra light or shadow, or maybe a different color streak completely. And the outcome is as follows. The original is so lifelike that it almost passes for a photograph, but I'm happy to keep my version of it simple. Next, I duplicate the layers and flatten the entire background, and add a very slight Gaussian blur effect to create some depth. Honestly, this drawing could probably be classed as complete as it is right now with no further changes, but I want to round it up by adding the water droplets. So, I make my rough sketch visible again to help me with the placement of the raindrops. On top of all of the layers, including the line art layer, I add in the flat shapes of the water droplets first using a light blue color and the ink bleed brush. When the flat shapes are complete, I turn off the sketch's visibility and begin drawing brighter outlines around the droplet shapes. Then I add some darker splotches on the inside, following the reference image as a guide. Next, I add some bright white circular reflections to finish up each of the droplets. And finally, as the penultimate final detail, I add a drop shadow beneath the droplets that are in contact with the leaf. This is the final outcome. What do you think? The total track time was 11 hours and 35 minutes, which sounds long, but is actually fairly quick for me. And this is what it looks like when you compare it to the original piece. Although it clearly has my own style incorporated into it, I really tried my best to preserve the spirit of the original, and I hope that comes through. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this video. I really enjoyed making it. The process was so much fun, and I feel like I learned a lot too, which is always a bonus. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a really great week. Bye!